Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Puneet. I'm responsible for product management and marketing at Infosys Finacle. Today it's my huge privilege to welcome Sangeet to this conversation. Sangeet, as you may know, is the best-selling author for Platform Revolution as well as Platform Scale. And today we're going to talk about the new book Sangeet is bringing to this world, Sandwich Economics. Sangeet, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Puneet.
I've been a huge fan of the work which you've done in platform world, and I'm very curious about this concept of sandwich economics and what's the background, where did it come from?
So the idea of sandwich economics is that a fundamental rule of the digital economy is that value migrates away from certain players and concentrates with certain other players. With every new generation of digital technologies, we see value migration. And what that ends up doing is we move away from an industrial economy where we used to have vertically integrated value chains to a much more stratified, horizontally layered economic structure where value sits at certain layers and moves away from certain layers. So I'll give a simple example. If you think of traditional retail, retailers used to be structured in very vertically integrated value chains, owning everything from the end user access right up to the relationship with suppliers. But if you look at how Amazon has restructured the economy, it owns a horizontal layer closer to the consumer in the form of marketplace, and coupled that with Amazon Prime. So once you sign up for Amazon Prime, you're kind of hooked and you are an Amazon customer for life. And at the other end, it owns a horizontal layer at scale in terms of Amazon logistics and fulfillment by Amazon, the warehousing and logistics capabilities that merchants need. So the merchants sitting in between get increasingly sandwiched between these layers. As Amazon exerts greater control over the consumer or greater engagement of the consumer, it can control merchants at that end and manage their access to the user. At the other end, it can control the terms of how merchants get access to the infrastructural, logistics, and warehousing capabilities. So this is a pattern that's not unique to Amazon. We're seeing this across the economy, where we're seeing a shift from vertically integrated value chains to these horizontally stratified models where the firms in between get increasingly sandwiched. We start seeing layers of concentrated value emerging and sandwiching the layers in between. That's the idea of sandwich economics.
That's fascinating. Can you talk to us a little bit about the way you see layers in the industry?
Sure, absolutely. So the way this plays out in a certain industry, it follows I'd say a four-step structure where initially all industrial era companies used to work as vertically integrated value chains. The reason for these vertical integration was that the cost of coordinating with firms externally was very high, and so you wanted multiple functions to be set up within the company in the form of vertically integrated structures. What happened with the rise of digital technologies and what happens with every new era of digital technologies coming in is that the cost of coordinating between different functions collapses. So you can now coordinate externally at the same cost as you could coordinate internally. So the cost of external coordination becomes very low. A simple example is, in the past, if you had to coordinate with external companies, you needed to set up contracts, you needed to manage workflows, and you needed to set up big business development setups. Now that trifecta of a contract, a workflow, and a business development team can be collapsed into an API. And the moment you open up an API and drive adoption of it, you are already coordinating with firms externally. So the first thing that happens is an unbundling of this vertically integrated value chain, because the cost of coordinating between these functions has now collapsed. As unbundling happens, highly specialized firms emerge which focus and specialize in one specific skill really well, and they are able to gain market dominance by doing one thing really well. This happened in financial services with the rise of fintechs. Initially, most fintechs that came up were just unbundling the bank. But the problem with unbundling is you don't get to capture value, you only get to disturb what exists. So the next step then happens, which is rebundling, where firms at a certain layer rebundle at scale multiple capabilities and gain dominance of that layer. And if you look at companies like Plate, Stripe, these are all companies that have done that successfully. Once you have rebundling, you now see the layers emerging, and at this point, as certain layers gain horizontal scale, they start sandwiching the other layers in between. That's the third step where the real sandwiching starts. And more value moves away from these other layers to these layers. And these layers gain scale largely because they benefit from network effects. They are able to extract data from other players in the ecosystem. They're able to do this at scale. And then we reach the fourth stage where once the sandwiching has happened, the horizontal layers can now selectively stack up other positions across the economy and through that gain a new form of vertical advantage, which is different from the original vertical integration. And I'm happy to go through this with an example, but this is a four-step approach that we see repeatedly in how sandwich economics plays out in an industry.
And thank you for offering to go through an example. If I may ask, could we take an example of an incumbent? An organization who's been very successful in vertical integration and having a pipeline-based business model. How should they go about, succeeding in this sandwiched economics world? And if you could take an example of any incumbent who is doing it right.
Sure, absolutely. I think, I'll take an example from the telco industry where we've got an incumbent that's really done it at scale. If you think of the telco industry, traditionally telcos were vertically integrated, and they integrated everything from infrastructural to data services to end user services all across the value chain. What we saw with the rise of digital technologies was first we started seeing a horizontal layer come up when the cloud came up and you could now host apps in the cloud, and so you did not need telcos to distribute the apps or handset manufacturers to preload the apps. And so horizontal players, Apple and Android, came up, which hosted the app on the cloud and Gate kept that access through an app store. Then we saw the rise of OTT players coming in telco, WhatsApp, Skype, etc., that created another horizontal layer because they allowed interoperable messaging between and across different telcos by creating a common layer on top of it. So these two horizontal players increasingly took value away from the vertical telcos. If I take an example of a company that got this right, think of Reliance Jio in India. Right at the time when India was going from 3G to 4G, and that's important to note because a shift in technology provides the opportunity to have a shift in economics, and that provides this opportunity for sandwiching to happen. Reliance Jio kind of flipped the whole script over here. Reliance is a traditional oil and gas company. It's worked in a pipeline structure, vertically integrated, done that really well for 100 years or so. But what happened in this scenario was that Reliance invested nearly $40 billion in setting up horizontal layers in the new 4G stack, where they invested heavily in creating 4G infrastructure nationwide. And once they had laid out 4G infrastructure across the country, they subsidized data and calling and launched a very cheap smartphone for the masses in India. And smartphone penetration was very low at that point because data services were expensive. But with 4G, you could now provide free voice calling, and that's essentially what Reliance did. And by changing the economics, Reliance gained horizontal domination at the 4G infrastructure layer and the data services layer, and very rapidly gained access to 400 million users across India. So what ended up happening was, because of this horizontal play, other telcos which were still working on 3G, they could not support the economics of free voice calling. So they started either folding up, getting acquired, and the telco industry very rapidly started getting consolidated. Now in 2020, around the time that COVID started, Reliance opened out its cap table, and the big tech players around the world, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Intel, Qualcomm, all started investing in Reliance because they saw the horizontal dominance Reliance had at the infrastructural layers. Facebook could provide a similar horizontal by bundling WhatsApp at the top. Google could bring in Android and create a much better smartphone within the stack. And so through that, Reliance Jio essentially flipped the economics, and instead of getting sandwiched as a traditional telco operator, started sandwiching the other layers and created new economics for the industry.
This is very exciting. If I were to shift to the banking and financial services, it's long said that what was seen as disadvantage to incumbents could actually be converted into an advantage in a sandwiched economics. Can you give us a little segue into how can existing banks take advantage of this concept?
Absolutely. For banks to think about how to play in this kind of an economic structure, The first step is to really think about where does value concentrate over here. And I believe value specifically concentrates at three specific layers. The first, as with the Reliance example, was the infrastructure layer. If you can provide industry-wide infrastructure, you can concentrate value over there. That's one place where we see a lot of value concentrating, and we see, among the fintechs that actually succeeded, companies like Plaid succeeded not because they unbundled, but because they rebundled as industry-wide infrastructure. Then above the infrastructure, there's another layer where you can concentrate a lot of value, which I call the integrator, where as more and more companies open up APIs and move towards a microservices architecture, there's an increasingly fragmented landscape, technical landscape, which needs to be standardized. Production side APIs need to speak with consumption side APIs, and integrators do that. An integrator would plug in a lot of financial services APIs from banks at one end and allow e-commerce companies to, for example, consume those APIs in the right way. And in doing so, an integrator also rebundles the production side APIs into specific customer pain points and serves that at the other end. So integrators are very important. Integrators can do this at the rate of structuring APIs. Even companies like Visa and MasterCard play an integrator role where they work across acquiring and issuing banks at industry scale. And that's very much why when Visa tried to acquire Plaid, essentially regulators were concerned about sandwiching, because Visa had this horizontal dominance at the integrator layer and Plaid had it at the infrastructure layer, and it could sandwich all the banks in between. So that's the second layer. And then the third layer is the aggregator layer, where you aggregate consumer demand at scale. Facebook, Amazon, Google are all examples of companies that do that. But in financial services, even more so, the aggregation play is important, because a lot of consumers don't think of financial services day in and day out. Financial services are typically secondary demand. The primary demand is what consumers care about. Payments, for example, we all need that, but we don't think about it. We care about what we are paying for. We care about mobility. We care about eating out. That's the primary demand. Mortgages we all need, but we don't care about mortgages. We care about living in a good house. And so the primary demand is for the house. So the companies that solve the primary demand for the user are the ones that end up commoditizing and sandwiching the companies that serve the secondary demand. Now, what that means is that for banks, in order to protect their play in the secondary demand, they need to have a strategy in the primary demand and ensure that the bundling of the primary demand and the secondary demand can support continued profit extraction in the secondary demand. So what I mean by that is that there'll be certain parts of the economy where the primary demand is where you'll end up making money and financial services will get commoditized. As the bank, you need to identify opportunities where if you can own the primary demand, you can still do a really job of serving the secondary demand at scale and continue making profits over there. Because one of the key things we've seen about incumbents in the digital economy is that incumbents win when they are able to identify highly valuable complements to their existing profit pool, which they can commoditize. So they win not by abandoning their profit pools and becoming tech companies. They win because they act like tech companies, but they continue making money like a bank. And the only way you can do that is by finding technological complements to your banking profit pools, which allow you to continue extracting profits from the banking profit pool, but bundling the technology around it. A simple example of that would be that if you are in the payments business, you want to ensure that everything into which payments gets embedded is free and widely accessible. So you're commoditizing all the other primary demand around the payments so that your payments becomes embedded everywhere and it's easily accessible. So that's the key idea. If you have to win as a bank in financial services in the sandwich economy, you need to ensure that the complement to your profit pool is highly commoditizable.
These are very fascinating ideas. The three opportunities you talked about in the infrastructure layer, at the integrator layer, as well as aggregation layer. We see many of our progressive clients trying to play at that
Right.
at scale. I'm also very interested in learning a little bit more about the control points you talk about. We definitely believe in an open economy, there are certain places where you need to have competitive differentiation wherein you control the market. How does this control point sit into the framework of sandwich economics?
Absolutely. The idea of control points is really important over here because you can play horizontally, but you are able to retain that value at scale only if you have a key control point. You can burn a lot of VC money and gain horizontal scale, but if you don't have a control point, you're essentially just burning money. You're not really building a defensible business model. That's one of the reasons companies like Uber still struggle, because it's easy to get to scale, it's easy to go horizontal and build that entire structure, but the switching cost from an Uber to an Ola or an Uber to a Grab is near zero. As a user, I can have both apps and constantly switch between these two companies. So there is actually no control point for those companies, even though they look horizontal. On the other hand, there are companies which use control points to manage their horizontal place very well. A very good example of that is Android. So if you look at Android has a horizontal play with its operating system and app store, and a lot of people think that the reason Android is so pervasive and successful is because of the network effects on the app store. The more apps, the more users want to buy Android phones and so on. But it begs the question, why can't Samsung start its own app store and LG start its own app store? And the answer is that they did, and they were very successful when they started their own app stores. Google had no right to win with the app store. The reason Google won was because Google had a control point called Google Maps. Without Maps, your phone is not usable. You cannot use it for navigation, you cannot have Uber, you cannot do a lot of things that you want to do in the real world. Google has the best mapping capability, and when Google gives its maps to Samsung to put it on their phone, they require Samsung not to set up their own app store. So using maps as a control point, Google is able to negotiate those positions away from all of its partners. So that's the key idea of a control point. If you have an important control point that you uniquely possess, difficult for others to replicate, and everybody else needs it, that's the way you win in the sandwiched economic scenario. And that's also the reason why Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, all these companies keep coming together to build mapping capabilities, because they realize that's the only way they can compete in this space. That's also why Amazon failed with Kindle Fire, because it did not have that mapping capability. Now, if you take this to financial services, even though, in the last 3 years, we've kind of switched off in terms of what's happening in China for political reasons, a lot of what's really played out from a sandwich economics perspective in financial services first happened in China in the late 2010s. If I take two examples, Ping An, which is a leading insurer in China, huge case of digital transformation in the last decade, they played out this shift from traditional vertically integrated model to highly horizontal sandwich model. And a few key capabilities that they used to go horizontal. First, they created identity management as a horizontal capability. So every bank needs KYC, but they went beyond KYC to say, well, KYC is good, but beyond that, you need a larger scope of identity management for the user. And then they started exporting that identity management as a service for other third parties to use, Ping An One Connect. At the other end, they provided Ping An Cloud, the bank in a box at the back end, which was infrastructural. And then they went into specific verticals. For example, Ping An was heavily into healthcare. So it provided an aggregator in healthcare called Ping An Good Doctor, which essentially manages telehealth and doctor-patient relationships. But its AI constantly learns from the decisions that physicians are making and keeps getting better and starts sandwiching the physicians. At the other end, because it was in health insurance, it provided the workflow infrastructure to all of these healthcare providers through which its insurance claims could be processed. So Ping An followed this very horizontal structure. Alibaba again followed a very horizontal structure where at the top it has an aggregator in the form of Alipay. But when it goes global, it goes into every country, acquires or invests in the leading payments aggregator in every country. In India, I did it with Paytm. There are many other players across the world where it invested. And again, things have unraveled politically in the last 3 years, but the strategy was to invest in the leading aggregator in every country and provide the Alibaba cloud as the infrastructure for banks in every country to build on top of it. So the idea was to sandwich the banking system in every country, every emerging market, between managing the leading payments aggregator at the top and having Alibaba cloud as the infrastructure at the back end. And those are key control points again, because Alibaba's unique control point is it has the world's best credit scoring algorithm for the cash economy, because it has trained that on the data that it's captured through Alipay in China. And banks in Pakistan, banks in Indonesia, they want to serve the cash economy, they don't have that credit scoring capability. That would have been the key control point if that strategy would have played out at scale.
Very interesting. And I see in our industry, in banking, people attempting to do this, what you just described as sandwich economics at the infrastructure layer. We see many of our clients coming together to create utilities where they feel like they can't do it alone, but they can do it together. In fact, in our own business, we run utilities for mortgages in Europe as well as trade finance in India. We see a lot of our clients very interested in working in the integration layer, some of them putting very significant investment in scaling out banking as a service proposition so that they can compose at scale with variety of brands, at the same time take care of abstracting out the complexity of banking processes as well as compliances. And we see many particularly large banks trying to play at the aggregator layer, where they want to roll out marketplaces for both financial services as well as primary journeys on where the financial services play part. I believe there is so much for our industry to benefit from the book you are bringing to the market. I, in person, looking forward to the launch and learning more about it. And thank you everyone for joining in. I hope you found the concepts we discussed very relevant as you evolve your business strategy. And we'll keep this dialogue going. I'm hoping you will join me in pre-subscribing to the book as soon as it comes out. Before we sign out, do you have timeline when the book is coming out?
It's still in the works. It'll probably be end of next year, early the year after.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Sangeet, for joining us today. It's always wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all what you're doing for all industries and particularly for banking.
Thank you, Puneet. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.